Good morning. Well, I have to confess that this parable of Jesus in our gospel this morning is one of my favorites, but maybe not for the reason that would first come to mind as a very fine example of eschatological teaching. For me, to be honest, my mind, and maybe this is just because I've been watching way too much Netflix, but my mind jumps to what we often do in the modern world with the whole wedding trope. It seems so comical to me that a rich, powerful man, putting it in the modern context, say a business mogul, someone that is feared and admired by millions, who has dozens of servants and lackeys and, people who just do his will without question. He's never been contradicted. And so he has this probably very rich and spoiled son who is about to be married, and he invites all these friends to the banquet, and suddenly he finds out that maybe he doesn't have as many friends as he thinks he does. So, business affairs are more important. Perhaps they have a trip to Bora Bora. They just can't be bothered. For whatever reason, he can't find anyone that he thought he could count on to come to his son's wedding. And so then my mind thinks, well, this could be great, though, because then the story kind of opens into this wonderful paean to the virtues of diversity, and he sends his servants out into the streets, and they bring in the poor, homeless alcoholic, and maybe the ladies who are working Fifth Avenue, and the mother in the park with the 3 children that are playing there, or the old couple, retired couple, down on the beach, and he just pulls all these diverse people, all these different races and sexualities and ages, genders, and he brings them all together in this big, beautiful banquet hall, and suddenly he realizes he has this insight to the real meaning of friendship and kindness and people who appreciate his generosity, and he suddenly repents of all his greediness and his narcissism, and he becomes a wonderful benefactor to the community. I think that's what Netflix would do with it. But then there's that great flip in the story that often comes with parables, right? Because then this man, who's of course feeling very warm and kindly now towards all these people who his servants have found to come to his son's wedding, he finds someone who's just not dressed correctly. And he immediately becomes enraged when the man gives no good response for why he's not dressed correctly. And he has him bound hand and foot, dragged out of the hall, and thrown into the street. And there goes my wonderful, redeeming, feel-good comedy. Now, I had to ask myself, why is my mind automatically going to something Netflix would create with this story? And I think it's because, and that twist at the end really brings it home, that when you reflect on the eschatos, or certainly, which in Greek means the last thing, literally the last thing in a series. So eschatology is about the study of last things. And this was something that in Palestine, in the period where Jesus lived and worked and preached and suffered and died, this was a very, very common belief, as common as our belief is of gravity. As common as we believe we've been to the moon and we've looked back and the earth really is round. Yes, it is round. It is a globe. So we just take these things for granted, really. And Jesus, I think, as a person in his millennia and time, and certainly in the milieu he lived in and the people he lived among, they believed this too. They literally believed that a time would come when God would grow tired of all this injustice, much as he did in the story of the flood, and he would finally send his angels into the world, and they would lay it waste. They would burn it to a cinder. And in the moments before it was completely enveloped in flame and destruction and brimstone and not one stone upon another, he would lift up the few, and they'd probably be very few. Some stories say just 12,000 from each tribe of Israel. And so that's, for those of you who do the math, that's 144,000 people. And that would be it, and everybody else would suffer for millennia writhing in horrible fire and destruction, until God would finally relent, and then there'd be a new heaven and a new earth. And this was just kind of the accepted belief. This is how it all ends. And of course, there is that happy ending. And I'm not making fun of this. I'm really not. To their mind, in the world that they knew, this was how God balanced the scales of justice. This is how it worked for them, a people who lived amidst great injustice, for them to see a time, to hope for a time, to believe in a time when there would be justice on the earth. It would have to be a new earth, a new heaven. And so, looking at the story literally, it makes perfect sense. The people who heard this story in Matthew's day, and to be fair to Jesus, this may not be exactly the way he said this story, because of course it's been redacted and probably formed, shaped a bit, and it's been, it was written down from the memory of what Jesus said. So, to be fair, I don't want to say that, Jesus literally said these things, but I think it's probably pretty close. And so I think, in the context of what they believed about how justice would be restored, I think it's pretty accurate as a literal telling. But here's the problem. I don't think for most of us in our modern way of thinking and in our modern way of conceiving the world, I don't think this story really can edify us literally. I think our minds kind of rebel from it. I think that's why I go into kind of my little fantasy about, this could be a really funny Netflix wedding story. But that would be a mistake, because there's still something here that's important for us to embrace. And what could that be? Well, I would suggest that if we look at a little bit of what Isaiah, which also is kind of looking at the last days, but from a little bit different perspective, being hundreds of years before the time of Matthew and Matthew's perspective, and how Matthew's community would have looked at the eschaton, or the last days. When you look at this story from Isaiah, you get a little bit more sense of a little gentler and kindler, kind of that idea that is in the story of God welcoming all, the good and the bad. And is it not said in another place in the scripture, God makes it to shine and to rain upon the good and the wicked alike? That God loves all souls. He wants none to perish. So this idea that they had, that the loving Father, of course, wants all his children to be saved and to be gathered in. That wedding analogy of Israel and God, that goes back centuries, millennia before Matthew. And so when we consider it in the great stream of reflection, then maybe the story can connect to our own hearts in our own time as that stream continues of consciousness. And maybe we can think a little bit of our own end. Even though we may not see the world ending in this, pummeling of the angels upon us of brimstone and fire, and, maybe that's not how we see the world ending, although, to be fair, there may be some Christians who do literally believe that that is the way it will happen. My husband told me that when his family converted and became Pentecostals, his parents would warn him almost every day that the end days were at hand and he needed to be paying attention. So I'm not going to say that there aren't Christians out there who still believe this will literally be the way it will all end. But I think, again, for most of us, we need to reflect on the story a little differently. And again, going back in that stream of consciousness all the way back in Isaiah and pulling it forward into our own context and our own modern life and considering it all, I think we can see that, yes, there is an end. Even as there was an end for people and for cities and nations and generations in the time of Isaiah, so was it in the time of Matthew and Jesus, and so is it in our time. I am at the tail end of the boomers, and we're going. My generation will soon come to an end. My life if I'm fortunate and God is gracious and my health holds out, well, maybe I'll have 20 or 30 more years. But certainly most of my life has passed. And as I get older, I reflect, what do I want to experience in my last days? I begin to think a little bit more about that reality. And honestly, something that Steve, Father McKee, has shared many times with us and really has been a blessing to me. But, at the heart of the Christian mystery as we live it is the suffering, the death, the resurrection, and the new life of Jesus, this cycle that plays out in our lives. And it seems to me that this can give us insight into what an authentic Christian eschatology can be in any generation. The reality is we will all struggle. We will all struggle with injustice. We will all suffer in our lives for one reason or another, whether because of just the natural order and our own natural weakness in that order, or because of the injustice that we humans commit upon the earth. How we deal with those realities, how we engage, how we work for a better world, how we try to alleviate the suffering that comes upon us, and more importantly, upon those whom we live among and neighbors near and far, that says a lot about who we are and who we want to be and who we want to be at the end. And knowing that and living that, I think, is what is meant to be called into that great banquet hall, into that feast that Isaiah speaks about, that Jesus speaks about in his parable. And all are called. Some won't want to come, we're told, but all, the good, the bad, everyone, all are called. And all come in. They're welcome, just as all are welcome at the table that we set every Sunday to the body and blood of the Lord that enlivens and gives us the strength and power to live this cyclical mystery. So what about that story at the end? Well, and this is the thing that I think just really tied it so much to this mystery of death, suffering, death, and resurrection. I think of the man and the way he was dressed, and I wonder, when we come in, when we're invited to be part of this ethic, of this way of life, of this commitment to love one another, to love our neighbor as ourself, near and far, and thus show our love for God, who loved us first. If that's what we commit to when we accept the invitation to come into the wedding banquet, then is not the robe that we wear the robe that Christ bore to his cross? Is it not the shroud that is wrapped about his dead body, that on that precious morning when the women came to the tomb, laid there empty? I think, for me, that's how I come to some meaning that pulls me forward, gives me hope, tells me I need to keep trying, keep being faithful to this invitation to be part of the banquet, as messy and unbanquet-like as it sometimes seems to be, and to remember that the wedding apparel for this banquet is the shroud of Christ in his suffering, in his death, but most importantly, in the resurrection, the new life, the new hope that will break upon the world in every generation. We are in a time of suffering, a time of death. But my dear sisters and brothers, a time of resurrection will come, just like the dawn after a dark night.